We have our next presenter, Ben Ouellette. He's an animal care specialist from Disney. He will be talking about demonstrating the effects of utilizing Arboreal irrigation systems to mitigate heat stress behaviors in Malaysian flying fox. Ben?
Perfect. I will get started. Thank you.
Okay.
So, yes, as was just said, my name is Ben, and I will be presenting on Disney's efforts to utilize a sprinkler system to help mitigate heat stress in our population of Malayan flying foxes. So we have, as just mentioned, the study focused on our population of Malayan flying foxes, and we have 11 males at our habitat at Disney. This bat species is approximately one of 60 species known of flying foxes. They live in Southeast Asia, usually habitating in primary forests, mangrove forests, coconut groves. They live in larger colonies that can be comprised of 100 to thousands of individuals. And the males in these colonies are normally observed to have harems of females, usually comprised of about 5 or so females. So our group at Disney is a solely male group. There are 11 of them, but we still observe a pretty complete breeding season in our species despite the absence of females. The breeding season we usually see beginning in early spring, May, June, with the bulk of the breeding behaviors occurring around late September, October area, and then tapering off into November. We'll observe a weight gain starting in that pre-breeding season and peaking around that late September, October time, as well as a testosterone gain peaking around the same time. They'll begin to lose all of that gained weight during the bulk of the breeding behaviors in the September, October, and we'll observe them losing about 21% of that pre-breeding body weight that they gained by mid-November. A lot of the behaviors that we observe them doing include sparring, but also holding pretty strict territories within our habitat, which goes along with our reasons for this study. So heat stress was the main focus of this study. Heat stress is something that affects pretty much all species of animals throughout the year, depending on their location, but can be especially detrimental to smaller species of animals like these bats. Naturally, bats have a range of behaviors that they'll employ to mitigate their heat stress and maintain a thermal homeostasis. These have been observed kind of on a scale from using least amount of energy to most amount of energy. And in the wild, they've observed simply shade seeking. So just moving location to from full sun to partial sun just to give themselves a break. Wing fanning at varying degrees. So starting every once in a while and then moving to very consistent fanning. And then finally, what's the more stressful behaviors, ones that require a lot more energy and kind of are indicative of a desperate need to mitigate that heat stress would be licking themselves, spreading saliva, panting, all of that to really induce an evaporative cooling in their bodies. At Disney, we created a chart that helps us analyze and assess when they're in the range of these behaviors, when intervention is needed to help cool them down. And it goes from a 0, which is really no behaviors being observed, all the way up to a 3, which is when you would see that panting, really heavy continuous fanning, licking themselves. And we endeavor really to never have any 3s happen at Disney. We really want to keep into that 0 to 2 range if we can. So that's what a lot of our proactive efforts are for. Here's a little overview of our bat habitat. As you can see, it's kind of a oblong oval shape. It's about 4,000 square foot, and it has a peak height of 24 feet. The habitat is lushly vegetated with large ficus trees, and these trees have kind of grown along with the inception of the habitat, through the ages. So at this point in time, there's approximately 3 feet of distance between the top of the canopy and the double mesh ceiling. which is easy enough distance for our bats to transfer from the canopy to the ceiling, but this was not always such. We have conducted previous studies dealing with the temperature of the habitat and cooling it off for the bats. In those studies, we used temperature loggers and compared the average daily temperatures in the habitat, and that was in the mid-canopy, to the average daily temperatures from nearby weather station. We did mid-canopy because at that point, the populations of bats that were housed at Disney did not actually roost on the ceiling most of the time. The canopy was much lower and they lived within the canopy. So you can see on this graph here, comparing those two temperatures, the loggers and the weather station, they're generally about the same on that before column, only about a half a degree of difference between the two. So then we employed our mitigation efforts, which included taking any solid like window panels or door panels in the habitat, making them mesh, adding fans, all of that increased airflow throughout the habitat. We installed a mister system, which mixed with the moving air and helped cool the bats that way. And then we did have the sprinkler system installed, which would use oscillating sprinkler heads from above to cool the habitat and the bats themselves. And looking at the most important data, which is at the very end there, the daily highs only, all of those efforts were actually able to cool the habitat temperature below the canopy on average about 5 degrees from the outside temperature, which was pretty good and actually helped those populations of bats quite a bit. Our dilemma, though, as I mentioned a little bit before, was that our canopy has grown in height and our current population of bats used that to their advantage and started to maintain territories on the ceiling mesh. But unfortunately, the way that our habitat is constructed, we are not able to put any cover over the ceiling mesh for safety reasons to provide any shade for the bats. So they are actually in direct sun throughout most of the day. And at about 24 feet off the ground, many of those other efforts are not adequate enough to reach the bats at that height to cool them as much as they need. The sprinklers, though, are still incredibly effective, and we decided to do some more data collection to really streamline the sprinkler process and make it the most efficient possible at cooling the bats. So again, we use those temperature loggers. These are Kestrel systems. And we, this time, instead of hanging them within the canopy, we hung them at various spots along the ceiling where we knew the bats were normal roosting spots. Because what we wanted to take temperatures of, the ones we were most interested in was the air temperature and the solar radiation. Solar radiation, more so because that's exactly what the bats are feeling. If you want to picture solar radiation, think about holding your arm out in direct sunlight and that temperature that it eventually levels at, that's similar to what the bats would be feeling. So we used the two main functions on this, the dry bulb temperature, which measured the air temperature, and the requirements for it to be the actual air temperature is it's measured in the shade, so no solar radiation is affecting it. It's above ground and away from objects. So again, no radiation from any other objects or conduction affects the air temperature. And we also measured that solar radiation using that globe on the top of the Kestrel unit. That black globe warms up as the sun hits it slowly, and there is a copper bearing inside, which will also slowly warm to indicate to the temperature reader inside that what the solar radiation is. And again, that's pretty close to exactly what the bats would be feeling sitting in the sun all day long. So knowing those, we were able to use our data to map out our findings, which were pretty pleasing in this graph. As you can see, the empty blue circles indicate air temperature and the red dots indicate solar radiation. And on the bottom graph, below the canopy, you can see that those two temperatures maintain pretty close consistency with each other. On the above graph, which is the above canopy, same thing. In the earlier hours of the day, the cooler hours, the solar radiation and the air temperature maintain a pretty consistent level. But then as we get to the hotter parts of the day, the air temperature stays at a lower level, but the solar radiation temperature increases much higher as it's not being shaded by anything. It's direct sunlight. And that's what the bats are feeling, and that's what our sprinklers are helping to mitigate. So we took more data. This graph shows in our previous sprinkler cycle, we would run the sprinklers every hour for about 10 minutes. And again, you see the solar radiation, the air temperature, maintaining consistency up until the hotter parts of the day. Solar radiation goes up, and then each time those arrows point down, that is a sprinkler session. And as you can see, the temperature drastically drops, and sometimes it actually drops all the way back down to what the air temperature is. So given this data, we felt pretty confident to conclude that the sprinklers are indeed an effective way to mitigate the heat stress at the bats at the hotter parts of the day. Which was great to find out, but now we needed to tweak it a little bit because our current system, as I mentioned, only allows for the sprinklers to run for 10 minutes every hour due to the parameters of the system. The sprinkler heads always oscillated, so no bats were forced underwater. They could always move to a non-wet area if they wanted to. But with those 10-minute sprinklings, not only were we adequately cooling the bats, but we were also saturating the habitat quite a bit. So with the data that we received from this study, we are able to purchase and install a more sensitive system. And this system, we were able to run every 15 minutes for about 3 minutes, which we found throughout our data collection was adequate enough to severely drop that temperature, as you saw in that last graph. So with the new sprinkler system, we have the oscillating heads, we have a much more streamlined sprinkler schedule, and the new heads also had a more fine mister system, which produced smaller droplets, less intrusive to the bats, but still adequately able to cool them without using excess water. And that is the conclusion of our study. And I appreciate you all listening. And are there any questions?
Okay, thanks, Ben. Yeah, we do have a couple questions we got time for. Do you have any pest issues associated with the irrigation system?
Any pest issues? Was
Yes.
that what you said?
That's yes.
We have not found any associated with the irrigation system itself. We as animal care staff do a lot of pest mitigation efforts within the habitat. So the mesh that I mentioned on the windows and the doors, they are small enough not to allow any significant pests in. We do a lot of waste cleanup on the ground from what the bats leave throughout the day, all to really kind of add to that pest mitigation.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Have you used air source heat pumps before?
Air source heat pumps? No, I have not heard of those before. No, we haven't used them.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Did you take any physiological measurements of the bats or just environmental and behavior observations?
So we did actually have a thermal gun, which we were able to use with the bats. We got some readings off of that. You had to be fairly close and not have a lot of other obstructions. So we were able to get certain pictures of the bats and use that to an extent. It wasn't enough data to really add to this presentation, but we did have a thermal gun that we used as well, and we could see the effects of the cooling. We used it on ourselves as well, just as test subjects.
Thanks, Ben.